Have you ever found yourself sitting in a pew, maybe at a study group or listening to a lecture, and you hear something that just doesn't quite add up? But instead of raising your hand, you decide to just kind of keep your mouth shut? Well, if that's you, you are definitely not alone. There's a great saying from our source material today: truth isn't afraid of questions, it is better understood because of them. Today, we are going to completely validate those hidden doubts you've been carrying around, because asking questions about faith, about traditions, or about history, that's not a sin. In fact, as we're going to see, it is an absolute necessity. Truth, tradition, and the image of God. Welcome to this explainer. Our goal today is pretty straightforward. We are unpacking some truly compelling source material that directly challenges this whole idea of checking your brain at the door. We're going to explore how shedding the guilt of asking those hard questions actually empowers you to step into a much more intellectually rigorous, action-oriented faith. We'll be diving into history, language, and ancient texts to see exactly why Christians really must critically examine everything they hear, read, or watch. Verifying what you believe isn't a lack of faith. It's literally the most responsible thing you can do. Section 1, Fear of Asking Questions. Let's just go ahead and address the elephant in the room right away: the emotional and cultural barriers that stop so many of us from questioning our traditions in the first place. So I want to pose this question directly to you. Why are Christians so often afraid to just ask? Think about your own hesitations for a second. Have you ever worried about being labeled a doubter, or maybe even a heretic, simply because you wanted to know the why behind a tradition you've practiced your whole life? It is completely valid to feel that apprehension, especially when your sense of belonging in a community is on the line. But our sources make it really clear. This aversion to critical inquiry is a massive roadblock today, and it's a fear we absolutely have to overcome if we ever want to truly own our faith. In the source text, 151 Questions Christians Are Afraid to Ask, the author points out something really interesting. Things like intense theological commitments, a deep-seated fear of deconstructing one's faith, and a modern focus from the pulpit on strictly practical life applications, well, they often leave the actual historical and biblical facts completely unexamined. A lot of folks just assume that because an institution has been around for thousands of years, everything they teach is already perfectly established. But as the text argues, truth demands to be rigorously examined. We really can't afford to just accept things blindly. Section 2, Made in God's Image. And this brings us to a huge theological pivot. Checking your brain at the door doesn't mean you have strong faith. According to ancient texts, it actually dishonors the Creator's design. The sources take a really deep dive into the Hebrew concept of being made in the image of God, or Elohim. Now, this isn't just about having a certain physical shape. It means possessing life, intellect, and the built-in ability to reason, verify, and choose. God made us in His image, complete with these amazing God-given abilities to think and analyze, specifically because we are accountable creatures. You were given a mind and the breath of life, the neshama, so you could proactively manage, understand, and critically evaluate the world around you. Ancient texts illustrate this contrast brilliantly. On the left side here, we have dead idols, statues crafted out of silver or gold. They have mouths, but they can't speak, eyes, but they can't see. They are entirely unable to reason. But on the right, we have humanity, alive, intelligent, and endowed with free will. Because you have the cognitive ability to evaluate truth, you are given a mind and the free will to choose what you actually believe. God gave you that authority, and He fully expects you to use that intellect. Section 3, Investigating Traditions and Truth. All right, so if we're meant to use our intellects, let's put that into practice. We're going to look at some fascinating historical examples from our sources that prove exactly why an evidence-based investigation of our traditions is so essential. The sources highlight two completely different ways to approach learning. On the left, we've got the a priori method. This is basically leaving your brain at the door, assuming that whatever traditions you've been handed are 100% correct, and then bending any new facts you find to fit them. This kind of passive acceptance is exactly what leads to thousands of conflicting doctrines across different denominations. Then, on the right, we have the a posteriori method. This is the rigorous, logical approach of critical examination that we are actually called to do. It means following the historical and biblical evidence wherever it leads to reach your conclusion. Let's apply this better method to a few things you probably know well. Take the celebration of Christmas, for instance. Did you know the New Testament gives literally 0 explicit dates for Jesus' birth? The date of December 25th is something that evolved over centuries. Back in 45 BCE, Julius Caesar aligned the calendar, pinning the winter solstice right around this time. It wasn't until 221 CE that a Christian historian explicitly tried to link this date to Christ. And finally, way later, in 567 CE, the Council of Tours formally established it as a holiday. Early church leaders intentionally merged existing solar rebirth festivals with Christian theology. It's a really fascinating man-made tradition that adapted over a long period of time, not a direct biblical directive. And this kind of evolution applies to language too. Even the name Jesus is the result of centuries of linguistic shifts. Look at this. Step 1. In the original Hebrew, his name was Yehoshua. Step 2. Over time, that contracted into the much more common Yeshua. Step 3. When it was transliterated into Greek, which actually lacks a sh sound, it became Isus. And step 4, much later, the English letter J was introduced, giving us the anglicized Jesus. It's just a compelling reminder that a lot of our most fundamental terminology has been filtered through some incredibly dense layers of human translation and history. We even see some pretty significant variances in the core texts themselves. If you look closely at the nativity narratives, Matthew's account places the birth during the reign of King Herod. Well, history tells us Herod died in 4 BCE, suggesting a birth around 6 BCE. But Luke's account centers on a Roman census under the governor Quirinius, which secular history records as happening in 6 CE. That is a 12-year historical gap between the two accounts. Now, the sources impartially point this out not to destroy your faith, but to emphasize the absolute necessity of reading these texts with analytical, critical scrutiny. We have to critically examine everything, rather than rely on blind assumptions. Section 4. Actions matter more than belief. Once we actually realize that traditions and texts require this kind of deep examination, it shifts our entire paradigm. We move away from passive mental agreement and step into active, accountable behavior. The really crucial point here is understanding how different cultures view the concept of faith itself. The modern Western concept of belief often just boils down to mental assent to a theology. You agree with a concept in your head, even if it requires zero physical action from you. But the ancient Hebrew concept, emunah, is entirely different. Emunah translates much closer to faithfulness. It is grounded in historical experience, and it absolutely requires righteous action. In this framework, what you strictly believe in your head matters little, because true judgment is always upon what you do. Believing something in your mind is practically useless if it doesn't translate into changing your physical actions. And this directly impacts how we view human nature. The sources contrast modern Western views of total depravity, the idea that original sin completely robbed humans of free will, with the Hebraic reading of Genesis. In the Hebrew Bible, God never says humanity lost its free will after the garden. Each person bears ultimate, undeniable responsibility for their own choices. Guilt is not some genetic defect passed down to you. You are judged strictly on your own actions and your own choices. As a responsible creature made in God's image, you have to be careful what you do in order to be right and just before your Creator. This is perfectly encapsulated in the ancient Hebrew words for good and evil, tov and ra. Now, these are not abstract philosophical categories floating around in the ether. They are highly relational concepts. Tov means your concrete, everyday actions actually conform to the Creator's instructions. Ra means your actions violate them. It all depends on whose eyes are judging the action. Knowing good and evil really means aligning your real-world actions with the Creator's standard. Because again, what you do is what truly matters. Section 5. Choose your own steps. As we reach the climax of this explainer, we want to bring all of this directly back to you. This entire topic is about deep personal responsibility and ultimately your empowerment. The texts remind us that sin is a constant influence, an adversary that constantly tests us in this dimension. It's a reality. But remember this, choosing righteousness brings peace. Living rightly and consciously making the choice to align your actions with the Creator's will is what actually fulfills your design as a human being. Sure, it is an ongoing, daily struggle, but it is a choice you always have the power to make. So here is your mandate moving forward. Step 1, examine what you are taught impartially. Step 2, evaluate the evidence without any fear. Step 3, understand clearly what is historically and biblically verifiable. And step 4, choose your life's steps. It is always a choice, so please do not let anyone guilt trip you into doing what doesn't make sense to your God-given intellect. It is your God-given life, and it is in your hands. We're going to leave you with this final provocative thought. What you believe up in your head matters little. Sure, what you think influences you, but what you do matters most. As responsible creatures made in God's incredible image, we must be careful to be right and just before our Creator. The choice to verify the truth and actually act upon it is entirely yours. So what will you choose to do with the truth today? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and remember, never be afraid to ask the hard questions.